All right, so what I wanted to do was to emphasise today the need for a really systemic approach to climate action. And that has many, many different sort of aspects to it. So I wanted to kick off just, I don't know about you, but you know, the release of the Ipcc report a couple of weeks ago from the climate science group, that's kind of generated some interest in that. So I thought that might be interesting for you just to kind of have a little bit of a snapshot just to sort of set the scene. And then I want to focus in on this question of impacts and adaptation. And in doing so, I want to emphasize what I see as the three capabilities that really are key, absolutely fundamental to all of us being able to handle climate change well. That's the ability to think systemically, so to see relationships between things. It's the ability to think critically, so that's in terms of, you know, who's advantaged, who's not advantaged. Think about fairness, equity, these really, really important questions. And think about the future, think about the capacity for the future to be very different as well. So when we put those things together, we're getting a long way towards what we need for adaptation. And just to give you a little bit of context, one of the kind of things we need to do is to really think in all of those different ways about how we can work together to adapt. And as I was chatting earlier with some of the organisers, to me, climate change adaptation, climate action and mitigation, as I'll talk about, these are not specific jobs. Some of us will have jobs where it might feature in the title, but we actually need to adapt and mitigate from within all of our jobs, all of our organisations, all of our lives and households. So this is a really generic thing. It's not about whether or not you work in this field. And some of the kind of competencies that they think about around climate change adaptation is understanding the challenge. And I hope today to help you along that way. And I'm sure many of you are completely up to speed anyway. And that relates to the one at the top around adaptation, science and practice literacy. It's about being able to plan and implement adaptation. It's crucially about being able to work together. And of particular relevance to this topic and this course is the ability to show leadership. So how can you, from within a job that perhaps doesn't have any sort of sustainability or climate change kind of component, how can you nevertheless show leadership from within the job and institution that you're in? So as I said, I wanted to just kick off just a little bit about the Ipcc and just give you a little bit of a kind of insight, if you like, into it. As I said, you might know this, but first of all, just to know that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it was set up to, you know, inform the climate negotiations that we're going to see at COP26. So it really does have a direct role. It's really about that science policy interface. The idea of it is to synthesize research evidence. So it doesn't do research itself. And one of the things that that means is that it can't speak about things on which there has not been adequate research. It also synthesises things to such an extent that one of the recent reports, the one on 1.5 degrees, they estimate that if they were to stack all the research papers together, it would have been 4 stories high, and they have to synthesise that down. So what that means is if there's not quite a lot of research, a good critical mass of research on certain topics, then we don't get to hear about them in Ipcc reports. And the danger of that is that people misinterpret those gaps, those silences, as those things are not important rather than those things that have not been adequately researched. So just to kind of, you know, really underline the importance of if you do have the capacity to do research, to really make sure that you're contributing to that, because it all really adds up. Unfortunately, the research and the evidence we have about things like climate change impacts is very uneven. And a lot of it is focused on, you know, the so-called global north. And so you hear more about that. And so there's a sort of squeaky wheel phenomenon. You know, the squeaky wheel's the one that attracts the oil, right? So we need to kind of actually balance that out. So I guess what I'm trying to emphasize here is that equity is actually really core and a challenge for the Ipcc. It's a very slow and bureaucratic organisation. It relies on voluntary labour, and personally I'm quite concerned about the sustainability of that voluntary labour, as in the capacity for people to keep contributing all of that time under climate change, so it's not separate from climate change. And perhaps the key 2 most important points here, one is that you know, it's highly conservative, so it's very, very concerned not to be alarmist. And it's also very much signed off by key policymakers as well, particularly the Summary for Policymakers. So that means its messages are all on the kind of underside of risk, if you like. They don't overemphasize risk. So just keep that in mind as we think about what they've been saying. So here's three of the most recent reports. One about what we need to do to try to retain average global warming to 1.5 degrees, which of course we're reaching very quickly. One about the relationship between climate change and land, and the recent one that came out a couple of weeks ago. So the key message, I've kind of, this might be a misrepresentation of haiku, but this is kind of me trying to synthesize down more and more and more into just absolutely the core message. So the core message of the 1.5 degree report is that every half degree matters. So it might not sound much whether average global warming is 1.5 or 2. You probably have people in your lives who go like big deal, take a jumper off. Whereas actually, if you understand it from an Earth system perspective, and you understand what that means in terms of the global planet, the Earth system, then you can see that it is a non-linear change in impacts. It makes a massive difference to the state of the planet. And so the main message was there, we really, really need to work hard to get those emissions down very quickly. The next one was that it's increasingly getting complex because we're getting these feedbacks between climate change, land, also climate change and the hydrological cycle. And so things such as fires causing emissions, which then of worsen climate change, increase the risk of fires. So we need to actually understand the planet much, much better. And that's of real concern as well. And then the latest report is that actually those feedbacks are not just possible, they're actually becoming evident. The impacts are starting to cascade through our systems, so flow-on ripple effects. And just think about COVID. So much of what we're experiencing at the moment is not about our personal interaction with the virus per se, though some of us may have experienced that. It's actually all the ripple effects, all of the responses that have been put in place, the consequences. And we need to act faster and faster than ever, and that window for action is closing. So that's all very sobering, and I don't say that to scare you for any reason. It's just simply that is the reality of the situation we face. So just to underline the importance of us being here today talking about climate action. So just to kind of give you just a little bit of insight into that final report in a little bit more. I mean, the first thing is that it just really emphasises that absolutely climate change is here. We constantly hear about climate change as something we need to worry about for the future. We need to worry about future generations. We are the future generation, or at least you are. I'm a fair bit older than most of the people here, I'd say. So, we need to really understand that this is something we're dealing with right now, and it's accelerating. So we need to really increase our action. Second thing is that at the moment, the emissions trends are on a very, very dangerous trajectory. And so we really need to actually work together to push those right down. Part of the problem is that, as I said, the Earth system feedbacks are starting to kick in as well, and that's making things far more complicated and complex than even the climate scientists realised. So if you like, a warmer climate is very much a moister climate. So what you've got is that water is cycling, more water is moving through the Earth systems much more rapidly. It's a more chaotic, a more energetic world, and that's why we get this much more volatile weather. So I was saying in the thorn little discussion just before, my thorn is that my ceiling has collapsed over in another room in the last 2 days because of a hailstorm that lasted approximately 6 minutes. So I felt like, I was like, well, at least I can see this is relevant to my work, but it doesn't make the hole in the roof any better. So yeah, water is cycling really, really fast, and it's continuing to do that. And one of the kind of crucial aspects here is that to date, about half of the emissions that we've had go up into the atmosphere have been reabsorbed by the plants and the soil. So they've been doing us an enormous service. They're saying, oh God, clean up after you again. We'll clean up after you again. But what's happening is that climate change is reducing the capacity for that soil and for those plants to actually keep doing that service. Also, of course, deforestation continues to accelerate. So we're actually finding that as the emissions go up, they're actually having a more powerful effect on the climate because we're not drawing them down again. So this means that future emissions actually will drive climate change more quickly. So that's just a major, major concern. And the last thing, couple of last things to say. One is that, of course, it's affecting all of the planet. The Earth system is changing more abruptly than ever. So as I said before, there's sort of this feedback, this idea of impacts begetting impacts, melting causes more melting, etc., through feedback such as making the Earth darker, absorbing more heat. What this means is that cutting emissions and drawing down carbon is, of course, essential. So just to kind of make that very, very obvious. And one of the core sort of concepts in mitigation is now this idea of unextractable carbon. So we just can't dig it up. The fossil fuels need to stay in the ground, because once they come out, then there's all sorts of leakage, but also the kind of temptation to actually have them combust is so high. So we actually need to really, really keep them. And that's particularly the case with very, very dirty, polluting fossil fuels such as we have in Australia. And the final thing to say is that if we do the cutting of the emissions, if we actually mitigate as quickly as we need to, it's not about just making the future more livable. That's certainly part of it. It's going to have long-term benefits, you know, and extremely consequential long-term benefits. But we'll also have all sorts of advantages in the short term. Even it will improve air quality immediately, and it will actually start to reduce the volatility that I talked about within 20 years. So that's how sensitive the climate is to the level of emissions. So it really emphasises the importance and the self-serving aspect of it, of actually addressing this very quickly. Okay, so mitigation is part of it, but I really want to speak today about this other side of it, which is adaptation. So it's really important to understand that climate change poses these two interconnected issues. So if we think of like what we've done today, so let's, you know, our dominant systems, how we got to be here in the world, and obviously there's many different systems at different levels, but if we focus on sort of the kind of a high level at the moment, then what we've got is a situation in which the social systems, and it's highly uneven, are causing both greenhouse gas emissions and a host of other problems. So obviously causing benefits as well, but they're also causing other problems. What that means is that we can get two main problems. We get the greenhouse gas emissions are driving the climate to change. They're causing the climate change. And we have a host of other issues, which I've called here the socially unequal vulnerabilities. So people in very, very different situations that are already vulnerable to whatever happens. And we've seen that with COVID-19. And it's when you put those two things together that you get climate change impacts. So climate change impacts don't just fall from climate change, they don't fall from the sky. We're not talking about meteors here. We're talking about a situation that interacts with our existing contexts to create impacts. So this is part of the relational or systems thinking, which is very important. And so what that means is that we have these two responses that we need to do simultaneously and in a really integrated way. One's around the mitigation and the carbon drawdown or sequestration as it's called technically, and one's around the adaptation. Okay, so I want to go in and look at this impacts question more, and it's partly because a lot of people I deal with in very high level professional roles don't quite get this concept of impacts, and it means that their thinking around adaptation is much constrained, and I really want you to have a much more integrated understanding of it. So as I said, climate change impacts, it is really an impact. So if the climate, if that hand there is the hailstorm, the degree to which you or I or anyone is squashed by that is dependent to some degree on the characteristics of the ground on which they're already positioned. So that's a hard ground, that means that impact will squash it harder. If it was soft and squishy and comfortable, then the climate change hazard wouldn't have such an effect. So what this means is that those potential climate change impacts then mean that we need to think about how we can actually reduce that. So that's the potential. This is the conceptual model, if you like. So we can do things to reduce those impacts. We can do things with mitigation to actually reduce the degree that climate change is happening in the first place. But what we can also do is reduce potential impacts, so reduce the risks by dealing both with the climatic side of it, where most of the conversation focuses, but also with existing vulnerabilities. So to cut to the chase, this means the better the world is today, the better off we are, then the less we're going to be impacted by climate change. That's the sort of crux of this. It really opens up the scope of what's considered to be climate change adaptation. And so the actual impacts then occur. And then, of course, that doesn't just stop. This isn't just a kind of, stop-start situation. It's completely dynamic. So we need to then understand that the degree to which actual impacts occur, so the degree to which there's damage and harm and losses, then sets up how vulnerable you are for the next thing. And so in Australia, for example, one of the things we've had, of course, was in 2019, 2020, we had some of the worst fires we've ever had. They were spatially unprecedented. 3 billion animals were killed. It was storms of such intensity that have never been seen before, storms that created their own mini storms and climates, fires that I should say that created their own storms. And so it's in that situation that we've then entered the COVID situation. And that's partly, I hope, not just poor governance, one of the reasons why we've struggled with some of the COVID aspects, because we were already coping with a problem. So we had that existing vulnerability. Having said that, interestingly, with the big fires that we did have, they were actually far less fatal from a human perspective than earlier fires, a decade earlier, the Black Saturday fires, in which 173 people died, whereas in the recent ones, it was about 36 people. That doesn't include those who died from smoke, who were hundreds more. But the reason is because we had some degree of adaptation in between. So we reduced our existing vulnerability. So while the climatic aspect of the fires got much worse in that decade, we reduced vulnerability by adapting, and that's partly because of a big legal inquiry that changed a whole lot of agencies and systems and policies. So even though the climatic side of it got worse, the fatalities reduced enormously because the system worked better. So it just illustrates the importance of addressing existing vulnerability. So another way to think about it is this model here, which is very core to a lot of the Ipcc thinking, which is to think about these four kind of aspects. It's called the Propeller Diagram. So one is the hazard. So that might be the fire, that might be the wind, the hail, the existing vulnerability, as I mentioned, our response, so what we're doing. So do we reduce our vulnerability, or do we actually do things that unfortunately sometimes we manage to increase our vulnerability? And spatial overlap, so that's the exposure, which is kind of sometimes implicit in that question of the hazard. Are you in the path of the hazard? That might be, are you in a coastal zone, or are you just temporarily passing through? So when you think about that, the important thing to say, and again, I keep trying to emphasize here the scope for positive change, is that social aspects, so social aspects of society, shape all of these. So the degree to which we actually experience a hazard, such as flooding, for example, is shaped very much by where we're putting cities, where we're putting housing, what we're doing with floodplains. So the floods are not inevitable. So there's room for positive change there. Likewise, existing vulnerabilities, as I've indicated, there's a whole range of different ways in which we can reduce our vulnerability and make sure that everybody is as well placed as possible to cope with whatever the climate throws at them. Likewise, ours and other actions, clearly that's got a social aspect. It is all about our social aspects. And likewise, the spatial overlap also has a degree of social change to it. So just focusing then on that question of the hazards, sometimes hazards are sort of, there's a kind of sense that they're kind of like, the act of God, that they kind of fall from the sky. What can you do? And certainly that's used in some cases mischievously to duck responsibility. But actually, all of these different hazards listed here in the left-hand column all have societal drivers, as you can see there in the far right column. So it really points to the importance of things like water management, our urbanisation patterns, questions around forest management, questions around our infrastructure. These are generating hazards. They intersect with the climate to co-generate hazards, or they intersect with the climate to not co-generate hazards. So it really just underlines that climate change really forces us to think much, much more carefully about the physical world that we're creating. What physical situations are we creating here? Another thing to understand about hazards is that although our kind of analytical framework is very much focused on kind of one at a time, we know in reality that they often tend to occur in groups. And there's a new sort of area of climate science looking at this. It's called compound hazards. The way in which it's often drought followed by rain that leads to a lot of the fuel that can cause and contribute to the fire conditions. And often these fires create, as I said, storms, and those storms in themselves generate very, very intense rainfall, and that can lead to flooding, which can lead to landslides, etc. So you get these flow-on effects just in the hazards. And so understanding that is a really, really important aspect of climate change. Then we need to understand the ripple effects, the flow-on effects that I mentioned quickly at the start around COVID. So, it's not just the virus, it's also the lockdown, the vaccinations, the working from home, the homeschooling, all of the different ways in which it's affected our lives so fundamentally. Likewise, if the hazard is some kind of climate change driven aspect, then it's often the flow-on effects that are most consequential for people. So in that propeller diagram, that hazard can be any of these flow-on effects. It might be the disease outbreak. It might be the increase in accidents caused by hot conditions. It might be the cost, the increased cost of insurance, or the fact that you can't get insurance. That actually then means you've got all these issues. So it just points again to the complexity of the situation. So here's a diagram. This is a special insight into what an Ipcc report may or may not contain, that our colleagues and I put together just to try to explain this point that the fires are not just about the fires. So the kind of simplistic model is that the fires, occurred, and then the last fire was put out on the 30th of March 2020, and that was it. That the fire's over, move on, next issue. But of course, that's not at all how it works. It has all of these different flow-on effects. I don't have time to go into them now, but just to illustrate that, it's often the kind of second, third, fourth tier of flow-on effects that is the most consequential and the most damaging. One of the interesting things about the fires that really was a shock to the Australian system was that it was actually the smoke that entered at least 3 capital cities into our CBDs, into our city offices, the smoke that ended up killing over 300 people. So while they were able to say, look, these fires weren't so lethal, it was actually these flow-on effects. And part of it is because we're all part of these systems. We're part of systems, or at least I am, reliant on centralised electricity, reliant on centralised IT, communications. And what the fires really revealed was that it was the way in which it interacted with these systems and caused these systems to be badly disrupted, often for weeks, that again was the main cause of the impacts for people. So we need to look at these systems. And that includes looking at supply chains. This is a really useful kind of understanding of it from a recent report from United Nations Water Program, where the focus is normally on those physical assets that sort of flood, can our pipes handle new flood capacities, are our bridges high enough and stuff. But actually for most organisations, it's either the second or the third tier out that's most consequential. Where are our supply chains? Where's our workforce? Where are our customers? Where are the other things that we need? How are they affected? And likewise, the broader disruptions to all sorts of services that we rely on around the outside. So just kind of trying to, again, get that systemic thinking going. And there's just all sorts of different aspects of this being played out. One, just to highlight, is that the drought in Taiwan, as some of you may know better than I, the hydroelectric capacity has been reduced. Therefore, the manufacturing of computer chips, it produces, I think it's like 80% of the world's computer chips, which is causing supply chain issues for all sorts of equipment right around the world, including in Australia. So just the kind of way in which, we're not distant from it. It's not just about what's over the sky in my little patch of the world. We need to be much more connected in our thinking. And what you see here is that these kind of feedbacks. So, if we have the drought and causing the computer chip shortage, and we also have the fires in Australia, this is a little bit speculative on my part, just to illustrate the point. The fires causing the smoke, which means that most people were then started working from home even prior to COVID. But, you know, that actually has increased, I know working from home has increased the demand for more computer chips because there's a demand for more laptops. But at the same time, you know, there's kind of shortages in electricity and et cetera, et cetera. I won't go into it now, but just these feedbacks and the way in which things are getting very tangled up. And let's not forget about the indirect effects. So these are the effects of climate change that actually have nothing to do with climate. These are the ones that are simply about how society is changing as a result of climate change being part of our lives. And so these might be things such as hearing about and being very concerned about other people's well-being. So as in, so it's not a direct effect to us personally, but hearing about others. And I know, for example, the loss of all the animals in the Australian fires was really traumatic. Anticipation, so a sense of dread and anxiety. And then all the sort of changes going around us in terms of what's considered reasonable now. You just look at the changes in the fossil fuel market and the pressure on investors to prove that they're taking climate action, the policy changes, and of course, geopolitical changes, which we hope don't get worse. So quickly now, what are the implications for adaptation? So one of the questions around adaptation is kind of what do we focus on? And as I said, so much of the current adaptation conversation has been very narrowly focused on how to reduce these climatic aspects. But what I want to really do is to focus your attention on the need for us to attend to things like the flow-on effects, the need for us to reduce existing vulnerabilities. So there are all sorts of things about, you know, how our society works. Anything that weakens capacity today will make us worse off when it comes to climate change. And we also need to understand that we're all connected and that, you know, weaknesses in some parts of the world could have reverberations back to us. So even if you take a very selfish perspective, you still can't put yourself in a little bubble. What this means is that we need to attend to a wider range of adaptation needs and also be very, very careful about how we go about adaptation, to consider the process. And so just to kind of understand again that we're reducing both the climate change aspects of things and the existing vulnerabilities. The question of how we do adaptation is illustrated by the controversy in the politics of the idea of resilience. I'm not sure if any of you have noticed this, but, you know, there's some very, very good and important things about the concept of resilience, particularly if it is based in ecological or social ecological systems thinking. But there are also some ways in which it often gets utilised, which are actually quite problematic. This sign here is from New Orleans following Hurricane Katrina, where there was real frustration about this kind of chipper kind of, you know, oh, thank goodness, you know, the people of New Orleans are so resilient. And what that can be used to do, while it, you know, may be intended positively, it can actually be an excuse not to actually address the major systemic disadvantages faced by many of the people of colour of New Orleans. And the damage of that has lasted over a decade. And of course, worsened now by the recent Hurricane Ida. So what we need to do is actually understand that sometimes what's resilient are systems that actually are the ones that need to change. Structural things like structural disadvantage. We need to actually understand the relationship between resilience at different scales. Again, sometimes we get calls, sometimes, for example, national resilience, and that's used as a reason to actually brush very roughshod, so very sort of violently, if you like, over individuals, households and communities' needs in the name of national resilience. And so we need to be very careful about these abusive ideas. And just to illustrate the broader point of being very careful about how we do adaptation. On the positive side, there's a lot of things about adaptation which mean we have this opportunity, this new window of opportunity to address issues that we've wanted to address for decades, those of us interested in sustainable development. And so one of the things is that as we think about global climate change, people have started to think more systemically, as I've indicated. They've started to understand that we need to cooperate and that we actually need to address some of these really, really hard questions that we haven't wanted to address. It's not just a technical issue over there. It really does require major social change. And so if we remember, climate change is SDG 13, it's one of them. But the way in which I've framed adaptation and impacts today hopefully help you see that actually adaptation requires we address the rest of the other 16 as well. So adaptation is really about all of the SDGs. And we can do that in a really deliberate way. We can actually really work to make sure that we do that in a way that improves lives and livability. We can also make sure that we do adaptation in a way that reduces those emissions, so that we actually really make sure that we're addressing both sides of climate change at once. And there's all sorts of examples of how adaptation can be used to progress mitigation. So it might be that question of like, well, adaptation, our health is all worse off if we're in a polluted air environment. How do we reduce polluted air? We reduce fossil fuel combustion, and hey, that actually reduces emissions too. Likewise, we're all better off if we have safe ecological systems that provide us with food and water, biodiversity, and as I mentioned at the start about the Ipcc report, we need those to draw down that carbon dioxide. Likewise, all sorts of systemic change as well. We're better off when we have transparent and democratic systems, improved cooperation, ethical innovation, and again, they can help with mitigation. So getting towards the end here. So the transformational side of this has to be taken very, very seriously. And there's quite a lot of literature now about this idea of transformational adaptation. So it's not just the incremental. It's not just about saying, okay, my crop's going to get a bit hotter. I need to change the variety of wheat, which is sort of where the conversation's kind of been stuck for a while. It's like, actually, we need to have much bigger questions about the paradigm of farming, the paradigm by which we have agribusiness industrial regimes that benefit big corporations over small-scale farmers. We need to have big, difficult conversations. So when we think about transformation, I always find it useful to think about these three kind of different notions of scale. One's to scale out. That's the kind of classic way of transformation. More and more people doing it. But another one is to scale up. We need transformation by changing the laws, the policies, the paradigms. And another one is around scaling deep, impacting our cultural roots, how we think, how we relate to each other. And another way to think about this is in terms of a kind of iceberg model. So a lot of action is at that top level above the surface, but actually adaptation requires that we don't just deal with, making our assets more robust or making shocks less likely. We have to deal with underlying patterns and processes, systems, even worldviews and paradigms. So just to come back to this is why it's important for us to understand that the origins of climate change, both in terms of impacts and mitigation emissions, come from something that's wrong. There's something wrong, and I've put question marks there. I'm not going to specify what I think it is. There's something wrong with our dominant systems, and we need to work out and address it very quickly. So just to conclude, as I've said, I really think that there's a huge opportunity here to think and combine these approaches, systems thinking, future thinking, critical thinking, and to really understand and work together in a leadership way, just as this course is doing. One way to think about it is, okay, so what do I have control over? What do I have some kind of degree of influence over, and what I'm concerned over? Most of us, as our sphere of concern expands, as we hear things like I've been documenting in this lecture, we'll go, oh my goodness, I don't, what can I do? I think I'll just choose not to be concerned about that. Actually, we don't have any choice. We have to be concerned about this. So the only option we have is to try to increase our sphere of influence, which we can do by working together and doing courses like this, and increase our sphere of control. What do we get to do? And just to quickly finish, what can we do in sort of more practical terms? Well, here are three things that I use like with my students and also research partners as well. One is to think of this kind of middle out strategy, which comes out of work around climate change mitigation. And most of us are going to be doing, very few of us work in jobs where we're right at the top. And sometimes we're right at the bottom, but often we have some degree of kind of influence. So you can just think about the way in which you work and think about, I'm going to stretch out horizontally through networks, exactly again like this course. I'm going to try to influence my political leaders, my managers, my organisational CEOs to try to get big policy changes. And I'm going to try to bring people along with me, whether that's family, community, friends, etc. And we do that in a way, it doesn't have to be formalised. There's a real power in what's called shadow networks, these ways of connecting. I've got to say the negative systems that are so resilient that we have to change are very good at shadow networks. We have to get better at shadow networks as well. And institutional entrepreneurship, so kind of being inside and outside, always maintaining that critical perspective. And the last thing is just to kind of come back to this, thinking about all of these different aspects of climate adaptation and just really focusing particularly on that one down the bottom of working together. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you.